The 80s redefined music. Super bright high-fidelity sounds. Rapid electronic dance floor grooves. And futuristic sonic textures. The acceleration of music technology has long accepted responsibility for the era's signature sound. But lurking behind the scenes is a devious accomplice. Coke. No, not that Coke. This Coke. It wasn't some underground niche drug in the 80s. Coke was everywhere. From the halls of Wall Street, malls of politics, and echelons of Hollywood, Coke became synonymous with the 80s. So much so that it may have slithered into music studios and unexpectedly altered the sound of an entire era. Seems like a grand conspiracy, right? Well, after these next 10 minutes, let's see how far-fetched it really is. Now, just to be clear, this video is in no way attempting to glorify Coke. We're merely exploring a popular urban legend among the music community. To say that Coke played a significant role in 80s musicians' lives would be an understatement. In a 1982 article by the New York Times, it states consumption within Hollywood reportedly ballooned in the late 70s, with the lieutenant of LA police describing it at epidemic stages. The taboo surrounding the drug had virtually disappeared, and Coke abuse had become so pervasive in music that some were spending as much as $1 million a year on it, equal to over $3 million in today's money. When you consider the names involved, though, these dollar amounts aren't so surprising. Whitney Houston, David Bowie, Madonna, the A-list of 80s icons snorting the snow goes on and on. Its influence is reflected very openly in the subject matter of popular songs, such as Eric Clapton's 1980 hit, and Elton John's White Lady, White Powder. But Coke's impact on music extends far deeper than song lyrics. In our 27 Club documentary, we dove into how the demands of greatness often force artists into a spiral of drug use. The 80s were no different. To keep up with demanding tour schedules and long hours in the studio, musicians found the fuel they needed with Coke. In an interview with Tom Werman, Motley Crue's producer, he discusses how LA ran on Coke during the 80s.
The entire town of LA ran on cocaine in the 70s and 80s. We used it as a real kind of igniter for creative juices.
And so that Coke period was the best.
It was. It was the most creative.
Coke wasn't just a party drug for social settings. It became part of the music-making process for many artists, providing stimulation for enhanced artistic creativity and output. So, could it have altered the sound of the music they made? In the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, a study published indicates that Coke use was associated with increased risks of high-frequency hearing loss. This graphic from the same study shows how high-frequency hearing abilities are significantly diminished both 24 and 48 hours after consuming Coke, only returning to a normal balance 72 hours later. To simulate this for you, here's one of my favorite songs from the 80s, as is, and then mirroring Coke's high-frequency hearing loss effect. Quite the difference. In the Journal of Hearing Research, another study credits this phenomenon to the loss of cochlea, or inner ear blood flow, that occurs when Coke is consumed. The inner ear is responsible for registering high-frequency information. However, with decreased blood flow, the inner ear loses its sensitivity to high-frequency sounds. The result is a normally balanced set of frequencies in music becomes perceived with a tilt like this. Remember this, as it's going to become important very soon. Undeniably, Coke use significantly alters hearing. But does that align with the classic sound of 80s music? Well, first, let's establish what sets 80s music apart. Record producer George Schilling notes that a lot of 80s tracks were quite bright, with perhaps less low-end than we are accustomed to. These two features are signature of 80s music, and show the stark difference from the previous decade of 70s music. Let's look at a couple of examples. We'll listen to two songs of similar styles, one from the 70s and one from the 80s. Notice how Paranoid sounds less bright and much richer in low-end depth. Push It to the Limit, on the other hand, lacks in that low-end presence, but significantly accentuates the higher frequencies, giving it a very bright sound. Here's another example. Same holds true here. We Want the Funk features a warmer sound with less high-end presence and strong low-end drive, whereas Let's Dance features a very bright high-end character matched with less low-end. Since these songs are of similar style, genre differences can't explain this major distinction in sonic character. But Coke might. Remember the tilted frequency response mentioned earlier? It just so happens to be directly inverse to the bright and diminished low-end character of 80s music. Coincidence? If musicians and engineers in the studio perceived balanced music with this tilted skew, then they would artificially boost the high frequencies and bring down the low frequencies to compensate, achieving a false balance. But there's a very important counterpoint to examine. The 80s saw incredible music technology developments. Digital synthesizers, instruments, and effects units boomed in use, becoming staples of 80s music studios. These tools, in particular, produced consistent high-fidelity, high-end sounds without the natural analog drop-off. With these tools becoming mass accessible throughout the decade, clearly that's a much more reasonable explanation behind the bright 80s sound compared to, oh, everyone was on coke, right? Well, not quite. There's no denying that tools like the DX7 are littered throughout so many 80s hits we've come to love, responsible for sharp and bright tones. But these developments in technology do not explain the significant drop in low end. Music technology advancements could only allow for better capabilities in preserving and accentuating low-frequency information, not hinder it. Digital technology allowed for brighter, high-frequency sounds to be produced, but that wouldn't diminish the depth and low-end presence already achieved in previous decades. Music would theoretically just have higher fidelity high-end while maintaining consistent low-end power. The 80s also gave rise to dance music like house, techno, and synth-pop, which became staples across a booming nightclub industry. A video topic that's soon to come. Anyone that makes dance music can tell you, the power in the club comes from a strong and tight low end. That's what makes the club shake. So with the skyrocketing rise of nightclub culture in the 80s, why would the music suddenly lose its low-end presence? It's completely antithetical. Another counterpoint is that it's a little ludicrous to think somehow every artist in the 80s was a coke-fueled creative. Many 80s greats, such as George Benson, Hall & Oates, and Angus Young, have been outspoken against the use of coke. How then could its influence be so extensive? Well, consider how easy it is for a new and unique sonic style to become standard practice. Take, for example, a classic 80s production trick, the gated reverb snare. While a normal snare sounds like this, the gated reverb snare sounds like this. It was the drum sound of the 1980s, and its origin story comes from a recording studio accident from Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins of Genesis. This sound first found its way onto Peter Gabriel's 1980 song Intruder, and soon after hit song made use of it. So if one studio accident on one song spawned the quintessential drum sound of the entire 80s, isn't it possible that the coke-influenced bright and thin low-end sonic style could have similarly been replicated across the industry? Doesn't seem like such a ludicrous proposition, especially since coke use was at epidemic levels within the industry. So with everything presented here today, the documented mass use of coke, scientific research into its effect on hearing, and connection to the sound of 80s music, Do you think there's enough evidence to still consider the theory that coke played a part in shaping the classic 80s sound? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think.